Okay, good evening. I'd like to get started if I could. With everything that's happening all around us, I do hope that everybody is healthy and well. This is the first time I've done a Zoom seminar like this. I have done some Zoom events with various brewers and things like that, but I was never in charge in doing it. So this is actually the first seminar that I'm doing. And it's not so much that I wanted to get into online seminars, more that this information about COVID and how it's affecting the sake industry in Japan, I really felt that a lot of people wanted to know what was happening and to get as much detailed information from the industry itself. So it seemed to me something that needed to be presented rather than me wanting to get into doing Zoom seminars. And that's why I put it all together and I'm presenting this tonight. Having said that, I am in fact, as I mentioned, doing SPC Live online later this month on the 5th, the 11th, the 12th, the 17th and 18th for 3-hour sessions each time. I will be doing that. So I better get used to this presenting to the computer thing pretty quickly. Before launching into the seminar itself, just a bit of shameless self-promotion. If you don't already, by all means, consider subscribing to Sake Industry News. It comes out twice a month. I cover news from within the industry. We scour the Japanese media and the English media for sake news. I write a story myself each time. And then we also interview a brewer every other time as well. And furthermore, there's an audio version. I dictate it so that those of us that are tired of reading things can use our drive time and kind of double up and kill two birds with one stone and listen to it as already. So if you're at all interested in the industry, by all means, consider subscribing. Your first 2 issues are free. If you're not happy with after the first 2 issues, you can cancel and it won't be charged for. So do consider subscribing to Sake Industry News. The flow for tonight, it's actually quite straightforward. I've got a simple presentation. It's a PowerPoint presentation. It's not at all ostentatious. There's no jazzy themes or zippy transitions, just some good solid information on the topic. In preparation, I scoured news sources for anything related to COVID, but I also interviewed a lot of brewers. I spoke to a handful of small brewers, a couple of medium brewers, and a couple of large brewers were very, very cooperative in providing information to me as well. So I kind of collated all that and put it into a presentable form, and that's what I'll use to present. What was really interesting to me is that there was really great consistency and consensus across the industry. No matter who I asked, they had the same things to say. The big brewers said the same things as the small brewers. The news was saying the same thing. So the good news is that the information is dependable. We can count on that actually being the way it is. But the maybe not so good news is that there's not a whole lot of great news in what was presented or what will be presented. And there's still a lot of uncertainty that is involved on everybody's part, all of the brewers' part. After the presentation, I'd like to answer some questions if there are any. I'm thinking I should use the chat function to do that. And we can go from there. What I would like to ask is let's start with the chat function. And if you can ask a question when I open it up to that, try and ask one that would be applicable to everybody or as many people as possible. If the situation presents itself, we can also do audio questions as well. I'm not exactly sure quite how it'll unfold, so let's start with the chat and we'll go from there. So diving right into it, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna share my screen and work with the presentation that I put together. Whoa, that's very interesting. Look at that. Okay. So the effects of the COVID-19 in the sake industry in Japan. What we're going to talk about tonight are some obvious things. Obviously, sales and shipments and how things have been affected because of that. And then some less obvious things. Employment, piled up product, how brewers are considering kickstarting again, or re-kickstarting, as it were, their efforts to sell sake. And then what the industry is trying to do, what actions they're taking, and what efforts they're putting forth. And then the effect on the rice growing industry, which is actually a pretty serious conversation that we don't hear too much about without looking for the information. We'll talk about a couple of silver linings, and then we'll talk about on what the future depends. So let's start with the obvious stuff. Sales and shipments have dropped considerably across the board for at least April, May, and June, or at least March, April, May, and possibly June. But just how much things have dropped varies from company to company, product or grade to grade, but also region as well. And let's look at some of the things behind that. If we look at some concrete numbers, Most of the numbers you'll see in this presentation, by the way, are percentage of sales for the same period of time last year. So if it's like 80%, that means it dropped 20. But so in March, shipments were down 87.3% of the last year. In April, they were down 77.2. So they dropped even more in April. If we look at grades, Junmai Ginjo and Junmai Daiginjo were down to 59.5% and Ginjo and Daiginjo to 61%. By the way, whenever the government gives statistics and they talk about Ginjo, they mean Aruten Ginjo and Aruten Daiginjo together. I don't know why they do that, but they do. And if they talk about Junmai Ginjo, they mean Junmai Ginjo and Junmai Daiginjo together. I tried to separate them in this presentation, but in reviewing it a couple spots, I noticed I didn't separate them. But that's the way that the industry keeps statistics. So both of those were down about 40% from where they were last year. Junmaishu was down to 68.8% of what it was last year. Honjozo, hapless Honjozo, which gets hammered anyway, was down to half of what it was last year. Futsushu, however, was only down about less than 12% from sales last year. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. With more than half of the restaurants having been closed in Japan for a while, sake that sells well in restaurants, which is mostly Ginjo and Junmaishu, and again, Ginjo, all four of the Ginjo types in Junmaishu, particularly suffer. They had a huge drop. Futsushu didn't suffer as much as we saw before, but hapless Honjozo just got hammered again. But seriously, Honjozo probably would have dropped significantly anyway, so we need to factor that in if we want to ponder the significance of the statistics. So producers focusing on one of those two extremes, in other words, if you focus on Ginjo and Junmaishu premium sake, you got hit really hard. If your production focuses on Futsushu or more economically priced sake, you didn't get hit quite as hard, but you either suffered or you benefited accordingly based on the type of sake in which your company focuses. Some extreme examples. One Hyogo-based exclusively premium producer saw sales drop 60%. Another saw 50%. And when I talked to one of the medium-sized breweries, he says those numbers aren't isolated. A lot of brewers saw drops of 50 to 60% of shipments during the past few months. And again, certainly this is indicative of small brewers focusing on Ginjo and Junmai. Restaurants were largely closed, so sales suffered hugely. However, retail shops, Jizake specialty shops, in particular premium craft sake specialty shops, did as well as they would normally do at the end of the year. So at the end of the year, of course, everything sells much better. You've got Christmas, you've got New Year's, you've got Oshogatsu, and gift-giving season, things like that. And craft or premium Jizake retail shops do a really, really brisk business. And the past few months, they've done just as good a business as they have done during the end of the year sales. Online sales were healthy as well, but overall, they're still quite small. And even though they may have grown over the past few months and brewers are putting more effort into them, they really can't support the industry. They weren't a huge chunk of revenue for the industry, so nothing they can really count on. One large brewer of the two that I interviewed noted that since their sales are so strong in supermarkets, the loss made up from the temporary closure of restaurants was made up for by the gain in retail sales. So many people went shopping for sake in, for example, supermarkets and things like that, that they sold so much more there that it made up for what they were normally selling in restaurants. And again, this is a larger brewery, meaning the sake they were selling was probably more Futsushu and in fact, maybe some pack sake as well. A couple of interesting observations. If you look at regions, which regions suffered the most? The regions with lots of larger producers, where most sales go is packed sake through retail routes, they did not so bad. Then there were regions with lots of smaller producers, and they see most of their sales go through online premise accounts, and they did very differently. If we were to look at the stats here, so Hyogo, Kyoto, in other words, Nada and Fushimi, they were only down 7 to 8% in terms of shipments over this period of time. Saitama and Chiba, which as you probably recall, border Tokyo. In other words, they border a very large market. So there are a couple of large breweries up there, in particular in Saitama, but some of the larger breweries from Fushimi and Nada have actually built breweries up in Chiba, if not Saitama as well. So you've got a lot of inexpensive sake being produced very close to the capital. Now, these aren't traditionally large producing regions, but of late they are. And we can see that they're benefiting from that because of the proximity to the capital and the type of sake they make. They're making sake that did well during the past few months because a lot of it goes through retail and a lot of it is less expensive sake. However, if you look at producer regions that have lots of small breweries in them, they got hit a lot harder. I've got Akita kind of set up a few lines above the others because Akita does have, I believe there's about 40 breweries active up there, and they do have a lot of small breweries, but there's a few large breweries up there as well. And so you've got kind of a balance of large producers and small producers. So they were down only about 25%. But look at this, Yamagata, Shizuoka, Ishikawa, Yamaguchi, all of those are pretty much small producers that focus on premium sake, on Ginjo and Junmai. And they were down, as you can see, somewhere between 43 and 53%. So they got hit. Those regions that have lots of smaller brewers got hit quite hard over the past few months. Shipments are slowly growing again. One brewer that I spoke to was in a meeting with a bunch of other brewers on promotions, and they said everybody expects things to be much better in June. Things are moving in that direction. I don't think we're looking at a V-shaped recovery, but things are inching back, and most brewers expect things to warm up, no pun intended, a little bit by June. However, restaurant seating limitations and early closing regulations are still in effect in a lot of places, and these will still dictate that any return to any semblance of the way things were may take well into next year. Another obvious thing is the seasonal sake. For example, Natsunama, Namazake released for the summer. The timing was just bad. You know, it comes out right about now. And I have heard that some of it is selling, but one particular brewery that I work with that has a couple of summer products every year, it's just like nothing, not moving at all. Part of that might be just the timing and no one's drinking expensive sake, but the other thing is that they ship them in 1.8 liter bottles, which mostly go to restaurants, and that has dried up quite a bit. So the seasonal sake, unfortunately, ran into some bad timing, and according to some brewers, isn't doing very well at all. Exports, not surprisingly, have dried up as well. If you look at March, it's down. It was down to 64% of a year ago. In April, it was down to 55% of 1 year ago, and that's volume based. If you look at monetary based, in March it was only down to 78%, but again in April it dropped to about 63% of what they were about a year ago. Note, however, that these numbers kind of lag overseas consumption. In other words, these are numbers, shipments from breweries, right? So the breweries ship it, and then it gets shipped overseas, and eventually makes its way through the distribution channel, and eventually people buy it and drink it. So if things dried up with people in restaurants and not drinking sake in April and May, or March, April, and May in overseas, it's probably going to reflect itself in May and June in export statistics in Japan. So there's a bit of a lag between these statistics and what actually happens in the various countries. And these are just some statistics from the various countries in March and April. The US wasn't too bad. China and Korea were hit very hard. In particular, Korea had their own struggles with COVID, but there's been some political things going back and forth between Japan and Korea over the past couple of years, and that's drastically affected consumption of sake in that country as well. So Korea got hit with a double whammy, actually. And I'm not exactly sure which of those two factors is affecting sake import there. They were at one time number 2 behind the United States, but that's dropped considerably. Taiwan and Hong Kong, as you see, didn't do too badly at all in March or April compared to some other places. And that's because of this. One large producer said that exports to countries, in particular some Asian countries, that have recovered from or were not hit so hard by the virus have been returning to their erstwhile pace. In particular, Taiwan, I think that's what we see happening here. Hong Kong, I'm not so sure. There's a lot of unrest there as well, and I really don't know how well or not well they fared with COVID, but their numbers don't look too bad based on that. The US, however, has not seen any improvement, and based on news of recent days, we probably shouldn't hold our breath for a big turnaround or a V-shaped recovery here either. Here's another obvious point. I mean, sake set aside for export this year has been piling up, and it's not selling at home either. If you look at companies outside of Japan that import sake from Japan, the one thing they want to be able to depend on is a consistent supply. In other words, if things run dry and they lose a spot on a shelf in a retail shop or on a menu, it's going to be hard to get that spot back. So the last thing you want is to run out of product. You've got to keep a good stream of ordering product from Japan, and you've got to keep your stock replenished in the country into which you're importing. And so usually importers in other countries will talk to the exporters and say, okay, this is what we see coming up for the next few months. Ensure we have this much for the next few months, and we'll keep talking and keep you informed. And that's a good way to work together between importers and countries and producers in Japan. So they've been doing things and trying to, what's going on there? They've been trying to make sure that they've got enough stuff coming in, but now it's not selling. And so they've got stock piling up in Japan. And that's a problem for a number of reasons. There's really nobody here that's importing it too quickly. So you've got it's not selling at home, and they can't really do much with it in the other countries either. We'll come back to that point in a minute about stock piling up. So small jizake producers of Tokutei Meishoshu, in particular, Junmai and the Ginjo grades, have been hit the hardest in Japan. The data on the next slide shows shipments from breweries in percentage of shipments in the same period a year ago. And to me, this is interesting. If you look at overall sake, so in other words, in January, February, before we really had much of an impact, if any, from COVID, we were down 7% and 9% anyway. In other words, sake is contracting. Sure, Honjozo's leading that charge, but overall sake has been contracting for a while. So it was going to contract anyway. So if you look at all sake, it was 93 and 91 in January and February. It was only down to 87 and 77 in March and April. Well, you could say that it was going to be down 7 or 8 anyway, because that's the way the stats were going. And again, if you look at Futsushu, look at that. 90, 90, and then it was only down 9% in March and 11%. I mean, that's down in the noise of error calculations there. So you can see Futsushu was barely hit at all, because it was probably going to take about a 10% hit anyway, because of the drop that they would normally have gotten. And again, you can see, though, more importantly, if you look at Junmai, Ginjo, and Ginjo, and Junmai as well, you can see the significantly bigger drops than we had in Futsushu. We spoke a minute about this before, how brewers can't really ship some of the product that they've earmarked for export. But if you can't ship what you have in storage, then there's no room to put newly brewed sake next season. And this applies especially to the increasing number of brewers that store in bottles or in refrigerated storage. In other words, if you store in bottles and you've got all the sake stored in bottles, if you don't move that out, you're not going to have room for the next sake that you've got to do. If you don't move it out of your refrigerated containers, you're not going to have room to refrigerate the next sake when you're ready to bottle that. But even brewers that mature in tanks, if they can't ship, they can't get the sake out of the tanks, and then you don't have empty tanks for brewing for the next season. So really, this is going to pile up, and the backlog is going to affect the next season's brewing as well. So this is actually quite a large problem, not being able to move the stock that you have. So moving on to some other less obvious things, sake being put aside. Without knowing how long this is going to continue, it's going to be hard to know how long they can keep people on payroll. Many brewers, many kurabito, are seasonal employees, but more and more breweries are moving towards year-round employment. And furthermore, you've got salespeople, you've got all kinds of people on the payroll. But if you're not moving any product whatsoever, just like any other business, it's hard to know, if you don't know how long this is going to continue, how long to keep people on payroll. Especially in larger companies, a lot of new hires, especially in larger companies, they traditionally start in April in Japan. These have been canceled or postponed or delayed a little bit, simply because of all the uncertainty that is involved with the industry right now. Like happens in the US and maybe other countries as well, companies do receive support from the government to keep people employed. Financial support to make sure people stay with the company until they can ride through the difficult times here. But this isn't going to last forever. And currently in Japan, it's scheduled to run out in September. And that's only a few months away. Next, all events since March have been canceled, pretty much all tasting events. It's hard not to be able to meet and interact with customers, nor to be able to do educational promotional activities. You're not going to move any sake if you're not able to talk to people to promote your sake. Even brewers, one brewer told me, look, we're just bored, really bored in here. And even brewers, we just want to get out of the house once in a while. So there's a lot of stress that the industry is feeling because of the fact that they actually can't get out. Another brewer pointed out that things are just naturally going to return to the way they are. It's not going to happen. They have to take some extraordinary measures, come up with new products, and make some concrete efforts in a new direction to kickstart things and make them move in a positive direction. So they've got challenges once things open up in just restarting everything. Um, More efforts would include things into online sales, again, which they're doing, including from direct from kura to consumer. Now, brewers can do this. They can legally sell directly to consumers, and most breweries do. But I don't think a lot of breweries put a whole lot of serious effort into it. I think they just kind of have online sales, but what they don't want to do is they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. In other words, they've got distributors and retailers working for them, and they don't want to undercut the people that help sell the products. So you don't see a whole lot of effort into it. But I think we are seeing more and more effort into online sales, direct from kura to consumer, in response to everything that's happening. I've heard of others, they'll shift to 720s. In other words, 1.8s are harder for consumers to buy and much more common in restaurant scenes. And a lot of breweries that would normally supply restaurants are saying, hey, the restaurants aren't buying sake anymore, so we need to shift our product to 720s. So they're actually shifting from bottling in 1.8s to bottling in 720s or rebottling in 720s, thereby meeting their sales goals. In other words, if they do that, they're able to move a lot more sake. To me, that's actually quite a clever solution. And I don't know if it's a long-term solution, but I'm happy to see the brewers are able to do that kind of a thing with some success. Next, countless Zoom events. You see Zoom events between brewers that people can watch. You see Zoom events with brewers and consumers, just constant Zoom events. I think we have the same thing happening all over the world, but there's a whole lot of Zoom events that are taking place in the sake brewing industry, and they're cool, they're fun, they're great. However, one brewer lamented to me that no one's really doing a good job of linking such events with actual sales. So there's a lot of Zoom events taking place, and people are enjoying them, but you don't see a whole lot of actual sales that are resulting from that. To me, this is really interesting. When restaurants closed down, they were of course allowed to make make food for delivery or carry out. But at that point in time, in March, Japan, you weren't allowed to sell sake out of a restaurant. Restaurants actually don't need licenses to sell to consumers in their restaurant. If you come to eat, they don't need a separate liquor license to sell to people that come to eat at the restaurant. However, they can't sell for carryout. But the Ministry of the National Tax Administration really rose to the occasion, and they were uncharacteristically quick in granting 20,000 licenses in Japan for people to be able to carry out sake. So in other words, you order sushi from your favorite sushi shop, and they can sell you a bottle of sake as well. So that was a really, really good effort on the part of the government and the industry, and they got them out right away. By the way, these licenses are only good for 6 months once they are issued, but most places have until near about the end of the year to continue to use those. So that was a positive direction that I saw. What they also are trying is new planned products to invigorate a stale lineup. I mean, one brewer's like, look, we needed to revamp our product line anyway, and this is a perfect opportunity to do it. We've got time. We can actually start to come up with some new products, new labeling, all those things, and give a completely new feel to our product line. And so some brewers are doing that kind of thing as well. One large producer stated that they shifted their promotional efforts to appeal to the increasing number of people drinking off premise. In other words, they actually consciously shifted their whole marketing to appeal to more people that are drinking at home and online. And they were somewhat successful with that, according to what they say. Until the on-premise market recovers, though, the focus is going to be on making the most of the off-premise approach and sales. They really don't have much of a choice. Another interesting thing that developed is there's about 300 companies, shochu distilleries as well as sake brewers, that began to make very high ABV products as hand sanitizers. Most of these were made using brewers' alcohol. I mean, the distilleries could obviously distill themselves, but sake breweries that had a license to distill, I suppose, would just add a lot more brewers' alcohol to get 70 to 80% alcohol. I've also heard that sometimes that stuff is watered down for safety reasons. And in that case, they would just redistill the distilled alcohol and put it back into the alcohol, into the sake. However, some shochu distilleries did in fact make their own distilled alcohol, and they would crank that up to 70 or 80% and distribute that as hand sanitizers. If they were to properly label this as not for drinking, the products were exempt from alcoholic beverage taxes, which made it a little bit more easy for all the breweries to participate. However, it's not expected to have a significant effect on the market or the economics of the companies that are doing it. So it helps a little bit, but it's not something that's actually going to save the industry or anything like that. Next, I want to talk about the effects on the rice growing industry. So I think, as most people know, brewers do not grow their own rice. And in fact, what happens is that rice orders for the next brewing season will actually be issued by the breweries in November or December. And then those go to the Shuzo Kumiai, the local prefectural brewers association, which then send them to the agricultural co-op, and it goes from them to the farmers, and they handle all of that. Obviously, there are some direct contracts, but it's basically the same thing. You have to start really early to tell everybody, whoever's going to be growing your sake, how much your rice, how much you want them to grow. And so the rice orders went out last December or November, before anybody had any idea how bad COVID was going to be. I mean, COVID was barely really a topic. And so nobody knew what was going to happen. And the rice orders had to go out way early. Well, then comes, February, March, and April, and all of a sudden the orders are out. They've gone, and it's very difficult to retract those orders. And now they say contracts are being reviewed. That's a euphemism for everybody's trying to cancel the orders that they made. But it's not quite that simple. In particular, as everybody knows, I think when you grow rice, you start with seedlings, right? You do that in a greenhouse or something, and that takes a couple of weeks before you transfer those into the water-filled rice field. Once you start those seedlings, there's no going back. You can't just throw that stuff away. You can't all of a sudden switch it out to something else. And you've invested so much time and money into that the farmers actually have to follow through with that. So once that starts, it's all but impossible to change the orders. However, there were significant amounts of orders or requests to cancel the orders. In Hyogo, about 30% of all the Yamada Nishiki that had been ordered, it was requested to stop that. Some were able to rise, some of the farmers were able to respond to that, and others were not. Omachi orders were reported to be down as well in Okayama as well. Again, Yamada Nishiki and Omachi get all the attention. I'm sure of all the other dozens of sake rice out there, in particular the top 10 or 12, they all went through the same thing. It didn't necessarily make it into the news, but certainly they all suffered the same way. Orders were made, and then orders were tried to be canceled, and sometimes you could do it, sometimes you couldn't, and that led to some future problems we'll talk about in a second. The other thing, you could just say, well, all right, just don't grow the rice, just don't grow anything. But you can't really do that. You can't simply leave a field barren, because the arability, the ability to grow something in it, will decline. You need to keep the soil arable. You need to keep it in good condition. Also, switching from sake rice to table rice or another crop is not that simple either. Since once you switch the soil, it's hard to go back to sake rice. In particular, persnickety strains like Yamada Nishiki and Omachi. I mean, once you grow something in there, going back to these sake strains, these sake rice strains, isn't that simple, because the soil itself will have changed and won't be as amenable to growing these fine persnickety rice strains there. So just not growing or growing something else temporarily isn't really such a good solution. Again, as I mentioned earlier, of the farmers that were asked to switch to table rice or something else, some were able to do it, others were not. So what this means is we're going to have a big surplus of Yamada Nishiki, Omachi, and certainly other sake rices as well. It's just unavoidable. I don't think the farmers can force the brewers to buy them, and it's just going to pile up. And they'll find a way to get rid of it somehow, but you're going to have a surplus. It's pretty much unavoidable. Because of this surplus that's unavoidable in the 2020 growing season, less sake rice will be planted in 2021. What you don't hear about as often is that if we ask the rice farmers to switch and they grow something else in 2021 because there's less orders for sake rice, we go back to them in 2022. It's like, oh, go back to sake rice, please. They're not going to be so all warm and fuzzy about that. It's more difficult to grow. It's more difficult to move. It has its challenges. So it might be difficult to get them to switch back to growing sake rice once we've asked them to grow table rice, which is inevitable because of the surplus that we're going to be facing here. If the rice goes unsold, the relationship between rice farmers and sake producers will sour. Understandably, it's a very tight business, rice growing is. If that happens again, rice producers will be less willing to grow sake rice in the future, since it's so much less of a hassle to grow and subsequently sell table rice than it is sake rice. And other kinds of rice too. For example, rice earmarked for animal feed or to be crushed to use in crackers and things like that. They're all classified differently. And it might be more lucrative for brewers to do that, and it'll be hard to get them to come back to grow sake rice if relationship has been somewhat soured. So one large brewing company elucidated this possible vicious circle scenario. if brewers can't ship the sake now that they have, then they won't be able to make any more in the fall. If they can't make any more in the fall or can make less, this is going to cause sake rice prices to crash because there'll be an oversupply of it. That will cause the number of rice producers to fall because they just can't remain profitable and live a decent life when prices are dropping. And that makes it harder to get proper sake rice, which leads to price increases, and the vicious circle can continue. Hopefully, this is a worst case scenario that actually never will happen. But that was one extreme situation that one brewer suggested is at least conceivable. A couple more things. So in order to solve all of this, right now, everybody's cooperating. I mean, the sake brewing industry, the agricultural co-ops, which is JA, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries, who's in charge of rice growing, and certainly the Ministry of Taxation, who's in charge of sake once it's been brewed. I'm sure they're all communicating now a lot about what to do about the planting of next year's rice. Hopefully they'll find a solution that works for everybody. As one solution, a couple of high-profile breweries are selling Yamada Nishiki rice for eating, just to support the rice growing industry. For example, you can get a 3-serving pack of Yamada Nishiki milled to 90% for about 348 yen. And at least 3 sake breweries in Okayama are doing the same thing for omachi rice. Personally, I doubt whether this will have a huge dent in how much omachi and Yamada actually move, but I think the gesture is important. The brewers are coming out and saying, look, we need to support these rice growers, and this might not amount to much, but we're doing everything we can. I think that gesture, that public gesture, is extremely important. I think that alone will have an effect, at least some positive effect. As I mentioned earlier, though, it's not all about Yamada Nishiki and omachi. Other prefectures and other sake rice types have even more complicated problems. I'm comfortable in saying that every prefecture that grows some sake rice, which is everyone but Tokyo and Kagoshima, as I recall, and Okinawa, are having some kind of problem like this. And it's going to vary from region to region. And if I had time to interview all 44 prefectures that are making sake rice, I'm sure I'd hear similar stories. But one I did hear about was Shimane Prefecture, which is very close in the southwestern part of Japan, very close to Hyogo, but on the Sea of Japan side. In Shimane Prefecture, there's only about 2 or 3% of all the rice grown is actually sake rice, only 2 to 3%. So as you can see, it's not a priority in the rice growers there. It's not a priority of the rice growing industry to focus on sake rice. So what happened in Shimane was the Brewers Association got on the stick really quickly and acted very decisively and very early. I should say early enough. Just in the nick of time, they got to the rice farmers and say, wait, don't start the seedlings. We're going to cancel these orders. We'll do what we have to do, but don't start the seedlings because, once you do that, there's no going back. And the brewer that I spoke to said they did it just in the nick of time. They barely got it done. Having said that, there was enough preparations already in terms of purchasing seeds, tools, boxes, things like that they needed to grow sake rice. And although the rice farmers agreed not to proceed with the growing of the sake rice, they lost a whole lot of money, about the equivalent of US $45,000. And the agriculture industry just ate that. They suffered through that. And my contact in Shimane said, Shimane was on the good side of things. We got it easy. Most prefectures had it much worse than this. A lot more money was lost and wasted in other prefectures. We're still on the good end of things. And again, my point to you is we hear about omachi, Yamada Nishiki all the time, but pretty much everybody had to deal with the same thing. And it was a lot worse than the situation I just described. Another thing that was pointed out to me is because in this example I gave about Shimane, only 2 to 3% of all the rice grown there is sake rice. So they don't have a ton of prefectural government support for sake rice. It's not a priority. Hyogo, Yamada Nishiki, that's a significant part of the economy of Hyogo. So the government was able to step up, and in ways that I do not know, but I've heard that they're actually supporting the rice farming industry to some degree in Hyogo because it's a significant part of the economy in that prefecture. My main point is we hear a lot about the Hollywood rices, the big famous rices, but I think everybody, all sake rice out of Japan, is having similar problems, and some of them are a lot worse than what we've heard. Silver linings. Unfortunately, this is the shortest section in the presentation, but I do want to cover what I did see as positive developments here, even though they're not as many as we would like them to be. As of yet, no breweries have gone under. As of me preparing for this presentation, none have completely gone under. However, some certainly will. There is a possibility that a good number of breweries will actually have to shut their doors. We don't know yet. Nobody wants to say that yet, but we just have to see how things recover. One producer spoke of massive pressure right now. Those are the words he used, massive pressure on a lot of breweries to try and stay in business. However, I think the sake industry is incredibly resilient. I'm not comfortable saying that means that most will survive or that this will happen or that will happen, but it's a very strong, incredibly resilient industry. So I think it's worthwhile hoping for the best in spite of the massive pressure that a lot of them are in fact feeling. Another thing that a brewer spoke of is that with all the travel and events having been canceled, we've been able to focus our plan several years back to grow rice in our own region. They wanted to start growing rice from years back. They said that's really the future. We need to be growing our own rice, and it's not something you can just jump into. So they wanted to start years ago to grow rice in their own region. They just didn't have the time. But now they just planted seedlings the other day. They've had more time for focusing on this, and they're actually excited about harvesting their first local crop of rice in this fall. So that's something they've been able to focus on. Another larger brewer I spoke to has been able to shift and focus more on off-premise and supermarket sectors, and that needed to be done with things like smaller packaging, smaller bottles, but also clever label designs as well. There's a producer in Kyoto that comes out with a sake, and they put something on the label called an amabie. And amabie is a legendary three-legged mermaid or merman. They're not sure what the gender is. That's the stuff of nightmares right there. But it emerges from the sea and either prophesies an abundant harvest or an epidemic. And for some reason, this brewer decided to put that on a label of one of the products, and it worked. It was clever enough for them to have had a product that sold very well. But other brewers are able to focus on new marketing, new labeling, bottle sizes, things like that. And you can see that clearly they're all committed to this for the long haul. It's not something that's going to be out of here when the V-shaped recovery happens. Brewers are thinking that they need to stick with new methods, new products, new labeling, things like that to get kickstarted again when they have the opportunity. And issues upon which the future is going to depend is, as long as social distancing needs to be maintained, sake consumption at restaurants will suffer. There's really no way around that. And that's going to be around for a little while. Issues upon which the future depends, again, exports should quickly return to a normal level in those countries that have reopened economies. Some countries I think are way ahead of others. I really don't know what to say about the United States. Things don't seem to be so V-shaped to me. I don't see people getting back into restaurants so quickly and not in large numbers. But some countries may move faster on that than others. But there are those that believe that exports will return to normal in those countries that have reopened their economies. If and when the Olympics are confirmed to happen, this will improve domestic consumption as well, thanks to the inbound customers that will be coming, hopefully in great numbers, to Japan. But we have to see how that unfolds. And this is interesting, is a number of brewers used the V word. A number of brewers said that a vaccine is important so that more people can get out more and drink in more restaurants. And that's going to be a key development in the return to higher sake consumption as well. Obviously, that does go without saying, but I was actually surprised to hear a number of brewers bring that particular point up. And another brewer, again, lamented that, there's a lot of things that need to be done. There's a lot of things we could do, but, the sake industry is an old, tradition-bound industry. It's just not going to change much. They don't try too many new things. But somehow it'll weather through it, and somehow it'll survive. And my just means let's hope so. Let's hope so. Let's hope that they are resilient enough and that they are smart enough and clever enough to adapt and adjust in ways that need to be done and recover as quickly as they can. And so just to wrap this up in a minute, again, exports altogether are only about 7 to 8% of all sake consumed. But at this stage, really, every little bit helps. So we have to do what we can. So what can we do? Drink as much sake as you can, promote sake as much as you can, sell as much sake as you can, enjoy sake as much as you can. That's all we can do. And really, I think it's going to be enough. It's going to have to be enough. So let's all do what we can in that particular department. So those are the things that I wanted to cover through the industry. I think a lot of it was obvious, some less so. I think a lot of people weren't. I mean, I think the effect on the industry, I'm sorry, on the rice growing industry is significant as well. And I wanted to share that with everybody. If possible, I would like to open it up to any questions that people might have. And if you could limit your chats to any questions you might have related to this, that'd be great. And if nobody has any chat questions, I can see what we can do about that moving on from there. Well, that means that it was an extremely thorough presentation, or that it was so bad that I didn't leave anything for anyone to ask about. So Sarah mentioned that imports to the US were down at least 50%. I'm sure that's the case. I'm very sure that's the case. I don't know. I think that'll vary from importer to importer, but it's certainly going to be that hard, I think, and we don't know when that's going to turn around. How can we help sake in the USA to the off-premise sector? Again, you're a person who sells sake. I just think spending more time in retail shops is the one way to do it. I can't think of another way, because going to restaurants isn't going to help it, but convincing retailers that their shelf space, their real estate really is worth it. And I've done that as much as anybody else has, and that's going to be challenging, but that to me is the one way to do it. Maybe social media, letting those that love sake feel how bad they're actually missing it and make them crave it more. And that'll just ring home that they're not going to get it at their nearby restaurant anytime in the near future. And so they should head and support their local retail shop is probably another way to do it as well. In the United States, there's 4 or 5 retailers that are selling online, some bigger and more well-known than others. I don't know how that's working in other countries, but that certainly holds some potential as well. The brewers are planning to store excess rice. Okay, we do have some questions coming through. I'm not accustomed to using the group chat here, so I'm doing my best. Next, storing any tips on supply chain breakdown. I haven't heard much on supply chain breakdown problems. I haven't heard of brewers trying to export, but not being able to find containers. Certainly the number of containers has dropped, but the number of exports going out has dropped too. So I think that the supply and demand has kind of balanced itself out. Or I haven't heard anything to the contrary of that. Bottles equipment, I haven't heard of any problems of that on the Japan side. But they may exist, and I may just not have been asking the right questions. I've heard some brewers are planning to store excess rice. Yeah, you can store excess rice for a season. Years ago, brewers would just say, no, you can't store it, because the rice will get old. It'll start to taste, when you brew it, it'll start to taste like old sake. You can do it, but you do need to keep it cold, and that costs more money. So it costs more money, more space, but you can store rice at least one more season if you need to do that. Just isn't something that people do. I think most brewers tend to avoid that, although it is at least somewhat possible. Diverting some sake to koshu or maturing sake. I'm sure people are doing that, but to me, one of the challenges with that is once you get that going, when you're out of it, now you've all dried up and you might disappoint the market, and then they turn away from sake and then they don't come back. To me, that's one of the problems with promoting aged sake. There's so little of it out there that when people taste everything they've had, they'll go back to drinking wine or IPA or something like that. I haven't heard anybody talking about diverting things to kosher or maturing sake, but they might happen. If you get sake that's just maturing too much in the brewery in Japan, they might have to divert it to another product or sell it as an older product. I think, though, that they can avoid that by aging at colder temperatures. They can slow down maturation quite a bit by storing at colder temperatures. So I think that brewers, my mind, and again, it's just surmisal on my part, that they would prefer to invest in keeping it colder so that it doesn't change as much than trying to develop a whole new product line that's significantly different in flavors and aromas from what they normally would sell. I know profits are down for sake breweries, and the last thing is to spend money, but how likely are they willing to spend on marketing? It's kind of crucial during such periods. I would agree with that, but remember, you're talking about an industry that really doesn't spend a whole lot of marketing in the first place. And certainly they should spend more. And to me, that's one of the biggest problems over the decades is they don't spend enough money on marketing. And you're right, it is more important now. And I think it's just going to be more challenging to get them to do what they previously weren't doing anyway. I think those that do a good job of it will continue to do so, but brewers that haven't really spent a lot of money on marketing probably will not be too motivated to do that. to do that in the near future, even in response to this. A brewer asked if there's any chance some excess Sakamai gets exported. You know, to me, that's interesting. I actually thought about that. I don't see why they wouldn't do it. And you look just like the man to organize that, Dominic. If someone could organize it, I'm sure they would have at least some excess sake rice that could be diverted overseas. But again, you've got to get it shipped over there, then distributed once in the United States. It's expensive to begin with. You could probably buy it more cheaply than it would originally cost. But to me, that is an idea that holds some merit, but would call for a lot of effort on the part of those trying to actually distribute it. More than one of my brewers, this is from Pat Ellis, more than one of my brewers has mused that the event industry, weddings, funerals, or ceremonies may change forever as people have adjusted to smaller groups, and they fear expensive, larger hosted gatherings might not return to previous levels. I have not heard that, but it doesn't surprise me, and I would think pretty much the same thing. I don't think people are going to get over the social distancing or mask thing anytime in the near future. I think we're going to be appropriately cautious for a couple of years, and probably even more so for and even beyond that. And I'm sure that's going to affect the large gathering event thing, especially in a country like Japan, where they don't ignore things like that. In other countries where they tend to forget things more quickly, you might see large gatherings happening again. But I think in Japan that might have changed forever, if not for a few years. And I think that has a lot to do with, and that will affect sake things as well. The next question, any word from Asahi Shuzo on their new brewery under construction in New York? I have heard nothing about that. And I do look for information like that in the news. And I can only imagine it's probably not good news, but I haven't heard anything about that at all. If I do, we'll probably all hear about it about the same time. But if you hear anything early, I'll let everybody know. Considering high ABV products are not helping breweries that much, do you expect them to stop producing those products soon? I actually don't expect them to stop producing them, because even if the profit is marginal to the breweries, there's a need for the products. They need high ABV products for sanitation. So they didn't do it really to save themselves. They did it by request of the government to have more hand sanitizers and things like that to be able to help out. So as long as everybody is using hand sanitizers and things like that, I do expect that to continue, even if it isn't not a major part of income. Are brewers taking steps along the lines of more masks, workplace safety, personal protective equipment, or existing practices considered sufficient so far? Remember, the brewing season just ended in April. So I'm sure as the brewing season winded down, they were a little bit more careful, but I don't think anyone's all right, obviously there's some breweries where brewing is still taking places, but the majority of brewers, I don't think have too much activity taking place right now. I am willing to bet, though, when they go back to brewing in September, masks, workplace safety, personal protective equipment, what do you call it? Social distancing while brewing sake. I think that those will be viewed again. I'm quite concerned about how easy it's going to be for average people to visit breweries. I mean, they had this Sakagura tourism thing just started up. I don't know what's going to happen to that, but I'm sure that's going to be affected as well. Someone expressed a concern about nefarious companies trying to purchase bad sake for the USA or other markets, which could damage the image of sake. Do you think brewers will feel forced to sell sake that's no longer the quality they wish, or will they more likely distill it or destroy it? I don't think they'll sell it if they don't think it's good enough to make it another market. Remember, too, they can do a number of things. For example, brewers legally can take sake in their brewery and charcoal filter it again and remove color and off flavors. So what I would see happening more than moving bad product or distilling it is just charcoal filter it again, get some of the character or color out, and then it's a perfectly good futsushu, and you've got a new market for it. So there's ways for them to move product that are perfectly legal and perfectly valid and are not as extreme as destroying product or even distilling it. But I don't think any brewery would I'm sure no brewery would actually knowingly ship bad product. And any importer worth their salt probably wouldn't allow that to happen as well. So it seems inevitable that smaller breweries will be the first to go under. Do I see this will lead to further consolidation in the industry as larger brewers buy out vulnerable smaller breweries? Well, Interestingly, I don't think the larger brewers are doing well enough to benefit from buying out smaller brewers. I think they've got their own struggles. There are a couple of companies that do that. There's 5 or 6. Oenon is one. Another was Koyama Honke, which is a brewery in Saitama, where they go out and they buy smaller breweries and say, okay, now you're under our umbrella. Just keep doing what you're doing. We'll buy everything you make and sell it to our channels. And that could continue, but even companies like that, if they've already got 20 or 30 breweries under their umbrella, they don't need another 10. Certainly there will be some breweries that are bought by other organizations, other companies that may or may not be in the alcoholic beverage business now, but you'll see some of that. I really don't know how common that will be, how much that will happen. Probably, again, it depends so much on how many actually have to throw in the towel and give up. So it's kind of hard to say. So some will happen. I would think more purchasing more than consolidation, but some of that might happen as well. But again, it all depends on how many breweries go under and how many are there to be dealt with. Yeah, someone, I answered that one already, I think. Do I think that brewers will move to making more futsushu for the newer, more accessible range of the market? I don't think so, because it would be hard for any brewer not already entrenched in the futsushu market to compete. In other words, the larger brewers just have economies of scale. You try and make a futsushu, it's going to be very difficult to make it as inexpensive as they are and to distribute it as well as they do. So it would be hard really to try and crack the inexpensive sake market. So I don't really see that happening, to be honest. I believe that I've worked through all of the questions. And if that is the case, I would like to wrap the evening up just about on time, as it were. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for participating. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that the information was somewhat useful to you. I will be posting this video on various social media. I've just got to figure out a couple of things on how to do it properly. So look for information from me on the link if you wanted to review this yourself or share it with some others. Again, consider subscribing to Sake Industry News if you're interested in industry news. Wish me good luck on SPC Live Online starting this weekend. And everybody, please do take care of yourself. We're not out of this yet. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, but we've got some time, both health-wise and sake-wise. So everybody take care of yourselves and be well. Good night to everybody.